This is the start of a series of videos I'll be doing on the darker elements to psychology, with each video detailing extreme cases, and I'll use these to explain the various array of dark personality traits and motives these individuals have. A strong warning to those listening, the content of this video is unsettling, involving descriptions of extreme brutality. For those who think that they may be disturbed by this, then please reconsider watching. This is the case of Pedro Lopez, aka the Monster of the Andes. And it's a disturbing one even to this day. This man is estimated to have sexually assaulted and murdered up to 350 young girls in the countries of Colombia, Ecuador and Peru, and his whereabouts is currently unknown. To really understand this man and theorize what motivates him, I'll first take you back to his childhood. Pedro, the seventh of 13 children, was born in Tolima, Colombia in 1948. During the height of the country's La Violencia period, and this was a 10-year-long civil war, responsible for the deaths of up to 200,000 people, and some estimate much more. This was truly a horrific time. Its name stems not from solely the number of people affected, but instead the manner of the killings, dismemberment, and torture during this period. The methods of killing and torture became so common that they were given names, and without going into the details of these various torture techniques, they were often named after the ways in which locals would commonly prepare food. The difference being that the victims were alive when these techniques were being carried out. These horrific acts were ultimately used to dehumanize the victims and used as a form of psychological warfare designed to scare and intimidate. Now, Pedro's father was killed just before he was born, and his mother was a prostitute. Now, he was kicked out of his house by the age of 8 after being caught by his mother attempting to molest his younger sister. Not long after being kicked out on the streets, Pedro was sodomized numerous times by an older man who had deceived him, claiming he would provide him with a place to stay. Now, following this, still homeless, he joined a gang of children who were also on the streets, who together would use violence in order to find places to stay and food to eat. After 4 years, he was briefly taken in by an American family who were distressed by his frail appearance, and this didn't last long. Pedro was molested again by a male teacher at the school for orphans that he briefly attended. Following this, he ran away. So I'll pause it here to theorize what could be possibly going on in this child's mind, given the experience that I just listed. The imagination is a fundamental element to the human psyche. We all use it to maintain control over an imagined situation by, for example, taking a mood that we're experiencing, say anger, and in our imagination allow it to take shape and orientate it towards a specific goal or direction. Now, this can work both ways. Obviously, sometimes it can help us deal with whatever we're experiencing in the present, and sometimes, which is often the case for overthinkers, this imagination can worsen whatever unpleasant mood that you're currently experiencing. This imagination often comes in the form of fantasies, and these kind of fantasies are frequent in childhood. During childhood, we often take refuge in fantasy. As children, our imagination tends to be a bit more elaborate or playful and less practical. Now, you may have heard of people speaking about manifesting. There's some credence to that, but the point here is our imagination is extremely powerful. I spend a lot of time speaking of the way in which we can harness it to our advantage, but the same could be said for its ability to cause destruction. And growing up in a traumatic environment, well, this can have severe psychological consequences for the child who seeks refuge in these fantasies. Because in these fantasies, we project what we've learned or experienced as a way of relating to others. So for Pedro, it's entirely likely that the personal imaginary world that he created reflected the hostility and the hatred that he had experienced in the real world. And the thing with fantasies is that it's entirely possible for us to imagine ourselves as being immense, and importantly, we can imagine ourselves without limits. For Pedro Lopez, this may well have been a lifeline whilst growing up in a world in which he had been frequently the object of the perverse control by others. Exposed to persistent brutality as a child without the chance or ability to develop healthy coping mechanisms. Common in the accounts of all serial killers, the refuge found in complicated fantasies that they construct becomes the coping mechanism. And just like any other addiction, the reliance on these coping mechanisms increases. So we're going to go back to Pedro's life now, where the story only gets worse. The following years, after running away from the family who had taken him in, Pedro began stealing for money, and these were crimes for which he was sentenced for. And 2 days into his sentence, he was molested again by a gang of 3 inmates, which he later avenged, killing all 3. Only 2 years were added to his sentence for this, as it was deemed that he acted in self-defense. Now, upon release is where his killing spree began. He was a drifter, and at this point, he would be sexually assaulting and murdering an average of 3 young girls a week. At one point in Peru, he was caught whilst attempting to abduct a 9-year-old girl from the neighbouring Indian tribe. Now, the tribe had actually tortured him and buried him up to his neck and actually planned to pour syrup over his head and let him be eaten alive by ants. However, he was saved when an American missionary intervened and convinced them to let her deliver him to the police. The tribe reluctantly agreed. Following this, the missionary instead drove Lopez to the Colombian border, where she set him free. His crimes continued, and he began travelling through the countries of Colombia and Ecuador. He was then caught again by locals whilst attempting to abduct another victim in Ecuador, and he was later imprisoned for this, where he reluctantly confessed to his crimes. He initially detailed the location of one missing girl he had recently abducted, and this was confirmed after the police had promptly arrived at the location. On further questioning, the officer asked him how many children he had actually killed, to which Pedro replied, and I quote, "Over 200 in Ecuador, some 10s in Peru, and many more in Colombia." After pointing to the location of 30 graves, he stopped cooperating with the police after learning that he was going to be charged with murder. I'm going to pause again and return to the now developing mind, picking up on where I'd left off in the last segment while Pedro was still a child, having explained the role of fantasy, and that the fantasy for the child raised amongst violence and subject to frequent brutality. Well, the content of this likely reflects the hatred and hostility experienced in the outside world, and also that there is a reliance on fantasy to compensate for the experience of reality that they want to escape. So this fantasy continues to substitute for the feelings of control they have never really had in reality, as well as providing a vent for the anger that they are in no position to express. As a result of a reliance on this fantasy, and as a result of childhood abuse, Pedro develops a series of negative personality traits, which results in only increased isolation. Traits highly prevalent in serial killers, such as a preference for autoerotic activity, which is the practice of sexually stimulating oneself through the accumulation of internal stimuli, which in this case would be the fantasies. Aggression, dishonesty, rebelliousness, and a preference for fetish behavior. Also common to a lot of serial killers is a complicated relationship to their mothers. Now, his mother had stated in a televised interview that Pedro would blame her for, I quote, "all the pain in his heart." And Pedro has expressed this directly himself at multiple points. He would speak of the abuse his mother also subjected him to, and in a rare interview taken whilst he was in prison, he had also stated, the autoerotic fantasies and experimentation only grow and become more complicated during the adolescent years of sexual development. And the key part here is autoerotic, and that by definition is the sexual stimulation from the content of an individual's imagination. And for Pedro, it had to be that way. Reality and everything in it is something that he would continuously avoid. Now we have the start of a self-feeding cycle, whereby as a result of anger, violence, and the lack of relatability you have by only associating yourself with your imagination, you only become more isolated, and as a consequence, the anger towards society grows, and the reliance on fantasy only becomes stronger. And in this situation, a fantasy which Pedro is always in control, always powerful, the level of processing of these fantasies as he gets older allows him to relieve the trauma suffered by reversing the roles, and in this way he is no longer the passive victim, but instead the active aggressor. This role reversal makes it possible to momentarily overcome the trauma he has experienced as a child. From the same interview I cited earlier, Pedro would go on to say, and again a warning, this is disturbing, a common motive for serial killers is this idea of omnipotence, which is just another word for saying all-powerful. Because they find relief in role reversal, the decision-making power of life and death infuses them with this feeling of omnipotence that in reality they don't have. And it becomes addictive over enough time, with Pedro now an adult, with more and more time spent reinforcing this mindset. This fantasy has gone so far as to become another reality for him, just as real as the outside world. And again, often in serial killers, they believe they can move between this reality and fantasy, with no difference between the two. Here, murder is not an isolated event, but instead, it's an outgrowth of the serial killer's fantasy. And even though the fantasy preceded the murder, in a sense, the act of murder solidifies it. The acting out of the fantasy has linked it with the real world. And in the killer's mind, the fantasy has become reality. And this is why narcissistic grandiosity is so common amongst those who commit these evil acts. They seem to lack the ability to distinguish between the all-powerful being that they act in their fantasy and the incapable, twisted predator that they actually are in reality. And to quote Pedro again, they believe that they have this kind of divine right to satisfy their urges without moral restrictions. And the reason that they become serial killers is that the acting out of their fantasy is necessary in order to preserve it. And so as time passes between kills, the predator's fantasy starts to weaken and he begins to experience the feelings of inadequacy as they creep back in, which is further reinforced by his current social isolation. He then feels the urge to strengthen the unstable sense of identity, and he does this how he has always done it, by repeating the cycle of control and violence. Again, going back to Pedro's life, where at this point he'd been caught and confessed. It's now 1980 in Ecuador, and he has been sentenced for 16 years for these crimes, which is the country's maximum penalty for murder. And it gets worse. In August 1994, Lopez was released on good behaviour. He was briefly rearrested an hour later and deported back to Colombia due to him being an illegal immigrant in Ecuador. Now, nobody had ever caught or charged Lopez for murder in Colombia, and because of this, it's reported that the authorities were then forced to set him free. And they moved Lopez back to Tolima, where he had lived decades earlier with his mother, in the hopes that associates of one of his older victims would come forward, and they did, and he was found guilty for murder in this area. Now, a psychiatric evaluation was done at the time, which was 1995. Now, the judge, after this evaluation, declared Pedro was insane, and as a result, he was sent to a mental health hospital as opposed to a prison for his crime. Now, in 1998, 3 years later, a new evaluation was done, which deemed him sane. Because of this, he was then released on $50 bail, and the condition that he should continue receiving psychiatric treatment and reporting himself to the police every month. He did neither of these, and he is presumably still at large, with his current whereabouts unknown. Pedro Lopez was diagnosed as a sociopath with avoidant personality disorder, not as a psychopath. And from the interviews I have seen and the information I've read, I would say that this is somewhat accurate. I'm sure for most, stating that this man is not a psychopath in everyday language is probably synonymous with saying he isn't evil. And this isn't the case. The research on dark personality traits and how they manifest is often conflicting, and it really has a lack of clarity. As it stands, however, since the investment into researching psychopathy, its description has become narrower. In short, psychopathy, as it's referred to now, is a neuropsychiatric disorder marked by deficient emotional responses, lack of empathy, poor behavioural control, commonly resulting in persistent antisocial deviance and criminal behaviour. Sociopathy is a personality disorder characterised by a pervasive pattern of the disregard for the rights of others, impulsivity, a lack of empathy, and manipulative behaviour. If you think that they sound the same, then you are correct. In practical terms, both sociopaths and psychopaths can be manipulative, they can lack empathy, and engage in harmful behaviour. The differences between them are mainly related to the fact that recent research is pointing to primary psychopathy as being largely a result of an individual's genetic and neurological makeup. Sociopathy differs in the fact that the disorder is seen to be largely a result of severe traumatic events and/or abuse that occurs often during childhood. So the differing origins of the disorders is what often but not always affects the extent to which these deficits manifest, and as a consequence, the behavioral differences that you can see between individuals with different disorders. So the stereotypical sociopathic individual has experienced some or many severely traumatic events during the course of their childhood, which really is the pinnacle stages to the development of not only our cognition, but our moral compass and emotional regulation. And as a consequence, they have a lack of empathy, but still develop shallow emotions, and therefore, to varying extents, possess some emotional attachment to specific individuals. Now, this often leads to them being slightly more impulsive than the stereotypical primary psychopath, and being that their aggression is more likely to be reactive and more likely to engage, or at the very least get caught engaging in antisocial behavior. They're also therefore less likely to engage in instrumental aggression, which is the kind you see with predators, as this requires a greater level of impulse control. So I use this case to start because it's really a great example to illustrate the overlap between these various disorders and the traits that you may have all heard of. For example, malignant narcissism, sadism, sociopathy, psychopathy. And it's a good example because you could make a case that the predatory nature of this gentleman displays characteristics that more closely align with that of a stereotypical psychopath. His aggression is not reactive in nature, but it's instead instrumental, as his crimes were premeditated. And quite clearly, he had a distinct lack of empathy. And there's no doubt that in Hare's psychopathy checklist, which I'll speak about at a later date, he would be classed as a psychopath. If you were to pass aside the likely origins of his behavior being that of a significant and repeated traumas during childhood, then the behavior this man exhibits, it's much more closely aligned to that of a psychopath. And the reason that I say this is because really the research on this field is justified mainly for the fact that it's supposed to aid in reliably predicting future behaviors of an individual, and therefore determine the risk that they may pose. And it really doesn't do a good job here, because fitting the criteria for a diagnosis of one of these disorders is largely based on deficits. For example, psychopaths lack empathy, or sociopaths lack behavioral control. This does a good job at explaining how an individual could be capable of performing such disturbing acts with relative ease, but it doesn't tell us why. And to reliably predict anybody's behavior, and this goes with life in general, you need a how and a why. And when you combine the two with Pedro Lopez, you get a fuller picture of truly how dangerous this man really is. So that's it for now. I hope you found this thought-provoking, and of course please like, subscribe and share this video if you did. It really does help. Thank you for watching.